So, our first speaker is Chris Fair. He's president of Resonance Consultancy. And Chris and his colleagues are the people behind the European Union Place Equity Index. And Chris will be presenting highlights of this index, which is utilizing both statistics and it is analyzing reviews in social media channels with the view to identify characteristics and place equity of destinations. And one of Chris's specialities is combining marketing expertise with future methodologies to help countries and cities to create strategies and plans for place branding. So Chris, it's great to have you here. Please take the floor.
So as Marcus mentioned today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about social media and how that's shaping the identity of cities, regions, and countries. So we saw some great examples of social media being used to communicate with consumers and stakeholders around the world, and look forward to seeing the award winner later on today. But I'm going to talk to you about a little bit of the other side of the equation of not just thinking about social media as a consumer communication channel, but thinking about social media and the data and the growing volume of data that's within it as a source of business intelligence. So our firm specializes in destination development strategy, planning, and branding. So we're thinking and working with destinations to help them understand what are their unique competitive advantages, how do they leverage and develop those advantages from a placemaking perspective, urban planning perspective, programming perspective, and then articulate that as part of their overall identity. And wherever we've worked, whether it's in my hometown where I live in the city of Vancouver, where we've done a tourism master plan recently, or working with our friends at Forza Ireland and creating a new experiential brand for tourism, or doing a strategic plan for an island country like Aruba that's very dependent on tourism and its identity, or working with a US city, a second-tier city that probably most of you don't know too much about, but working with a city like Cincinnati to help think about a destination development strategy to attract talent, investment, and tourism to their city. In all of these different places, we're faced with the same question. Another project is Haiti, and I put that one in sort of a separate category, just to point out that if you ever think you have a difficult job marketing or branding your destination, imagine that you're the Minister of Tourism for the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. And it should make you feel a little bit better about your job and your destination. But the Minister of Tourism in Haiti, Stephanie Vildrouin, is one of my heroes, and we've enjoyed working on 3 projects, creating plans for Haiti, which is really rewarding, looking at how you can try and change a country literally from the ground up. But in all of these places, the question is the same, whether it's Haiti, Cincinnati, Ireland, Vancouver, or any other destination that we look at, is trying to think about, well, what defines competitive identity today, and how do you measure the experiential quality of one destination to the next? So these 2 overarching questions have been with us in every project that we work on. There's many different arguments in terms of what defines a brand or competitive identity. And I'm going to give you our take on that today. But the experiential quality has been one that's really been difficult. Whenever we've gone into, and we talked yesterday in the workshop about stakeholder engagement, consultation, doing visitor surveys, asking residents what they think, community, business leaders, and that's all well and good, but it doesn't ever give us the ability to benchmark and compare, well, what makes Paris really different than London, or Copenhagen different than Oslo? And I'm going to show you our approach today of how we've dealt with this question to be able to try and understand the differentiating characteristics from an experiential perspective of one place to the next. So to start off, we were thinking about, well, what's important in terms of defining identity, to answer that first question about what defines competitive identity. So last year we did a study. We interviewed over 1,200 what we call mobile millennials. So these were millennials across the US that had traveled in the last 12 months and paid for accommodation. And they were largely educated. They had household income of over $50,000. Half of them were married, a little over half had kids already. So a little bit of a different subset. They represented about 1/3 of the overall millennial population of 18 to 34-year-olds. And we wanted to talk to these people because we felt these are the ones that are most likely to consider moving cities. They're certainly the ones that are most likely to consider travel. So these mobile millennials are the target audience, whether it's from an economic development perspective or a tourism attraction, that most of our clients and cities are looking at. And we asked them, what's the most important criteria for you when you consider a place to visit? And this list will show you that at the top of the list is safety in the US. Second, of course, is cost. They're more cost conscious than a lot of consumers. Then things like climate, nature and scenery. Interestingly, opportunities to learn actually is something that's more important than nightlife. And then things like accessibility by plane. This generation is more interested in being able to access destinations by commercial flights than other generations have been in the past. And then, of course, the cultural attractions, fun attractions, exciting city environment, and then being close to a beach or access to water. So some of these things like safety, there are metrics for. Cost we can measure. Climate we can understand in terms of there's quantify and measure. But when you get to things like scenery and nature, or opportunities to learn, or cultural attractions, or fun attractions, it becomes much more difficult to measure and how well one city is performing in each of those areas that are they're not tangible things. They're much more the intangible experiences, or what I call the software of the city, the tapestry of culture and nightlife experiences that happen within a city or a destination. The next question we asked them, was that we asked them, what's important to you in a place to live? So we looked at a place to visit, one set of criteria, and then also we're trying to think about talent attraction, what's important to them when they think about a place to live. And some of them, quite a few of them actually, are the same. Rather than cost for your vacation, it's housing affordability. Then, of course, job opportunities is at the top of the list. But then as you work your way down the list, you start to see scenery and nature, favorable climate, quality of restaurants, quality of nightlife, parks and recreation. Again, these intangible experiences are at the top of the list in terms of their decision-making criteria on considering a new city as a place to live. And I thought I was struck by this quote. Florian from Place Brand Observer did an interview with Philip Kotler, really one of the first authors in our industry in terms of articulating what marketing of places is all about. And this book was over 20 years old now. And he was reflecting and said, really the problem he realized 20 years later is not so much to brand the city, but to make the city into a better city, a cleaner city, a caring city, a city with interesting things to see and do. And I really emphasize the interesting things to see and do because that's exactly what we see in our research. It was, yes, safety, but then also the nightlife, the restaurants, the culture. These interesting things to see and do are what are moving the needle for this millennial generation. So that had us starting to think that really in this branding space, we talk a lot about brand equity from a consumer packaged goods perspective, and I come from a consumer marketing background. But as we thought about it and we looked at these criteria, we said, really, we shouldn't be thinking about brand equity. What we should be talking about is something what we call place equity, which is a derivative of that, but it's similar definition of looking at what are the assets and liabilities within a city that shape its perceived attractiveness as a place to live, visit, or invest. So that was our definition of saying, well, now our next question is, what assets and liabilities matter? So we had the research from the millennials that we just went through, and we said, well, how are we going to measure nightlife? How are we going to measure restaurants? How do we measure fun attractions? How are we going to measure cultural attractions? And that's when we turned to the data that we could find in social media channels. And as I mentioned, most of us are thinking about social media as a vehicle to communicate with audiences. And yes, that's imperative, and it's a fantastic opportunity and a powerful channel, but it's also powerful feedback. There are now over 270 million consumer-generated reviews just in TripAdvisor and Yelp alone for millions of places, experiences around the world. And this volume is growing on a daily basis. So we now see that consumers, we're not only able to communicate with them with social media, but we see increasingly the power of social media as this next generation looks and evaluates places in terms of their nightlife, their restaurants, the interesting things to see and do. They're turning to social media channels, looking at ratings and reviews, and the perception and the identity of your city or your destination is increasingly being shaped by these ratings and reviews and the growing volume of data and information within these social media channels. So again, if you remember, just to underline the importance of that, these were our top 10 criteria for a place to visit. You don't have to go very far down the list when you get down to 11 and 12 and you see, well, guess what number 12 is? It's online ratings and reviews. So that really validated our hypothesis with respect to the importance social media had in affecting and influencing their decisions. So more than a marketing channel, the key takeaway, what I want to communicate with you today, is that social media can also be a source of business intelligence. And that you can use that to understand and benchmark your destination. So in our Place Equity Index, we looked at and said, there are some of these things like you saw, as I mentioned earlier, safety, climate, These are things that are very quantifiable. And we looked at those core statistics and then are combining data from social media channels. So we have 22 factors in the European Union Place Equity Index. 10 of those are core statistics and 12 of those are coming from social media channels. And we're grouping those into 6 categories that we think are what define competitive identity for a city or a destination. The first is place itself. And that's quite easy, that's tangible. The perceived quality of a community is both its natural environment, in terms of its climate, but then also the built environment in terms of parks, landmarks, interesting neighborhoods. And for those particular things, we're pulling that data from social media channels to identify, well, how many very good or excellent landmarks are there in your city? How many very good or excellent parks are there? And we can pull that from social media, and again, it's an apples to apples comparison then when we look at from one destination to the next. The next is product. Product is the hardware of place. Communities, key institutions, universities, attractions, and those are tangible things as well that we're able to identify quite easily. More difficult then is the programming, and all of our data for programming is coming out of social media channels, shopping, nightlife, etc. And then people. People are what define a place, as much as we heard from some of our speakers this morning in terms of what define their DNA. And we're looking at, well, what's the diversity? What's the educational attainment of the population? And then, of course, prosperity. You know, you think of a situation in the Americas, we have Detroit. Well, how has Detroit's brand and perceived identity been shaped by its lack of economic prosperity versus other cities here like London, which the prosperity and the businesses here shape and the income of people shape our perception of the city. And then lastly, the last thing we're actually looking at, which most destinations look at first, is how effective are they in promotion in terms of how much are they being talked about around the world. So in this model, we're looking at from 6 different perspectives: the place, the product, the programming, people, the prosperity, and the efficiency of the promotion. For us is a new view in terms of understanding, a new framework to look at competitive identity and understand what makes up one city or another. And I'm going to give you a few examples. When we take all of this data for London, there are over 1 million data points in terms of the ratings and reviews, and we've consolidated that all into different groups, and we look at it on a relative basis. And this is London compared in each of the 6 categories, the relative strength. So the closer they are, the more green you see, the stronger they are in that particular category. So London doesn't actually rank first in place, but it does rank first in promotion. And London overall, when we average out the rankings, has the strongest competitive identity, the highest level of place equity in our model. But what I want you to see is to sort of visualize then how we can look at and understand taking all of this data and grouping it together to visualize one city to the next. So this is Paris, which ranked number 2 overall. And Paris is quite a well-rounded brand. We heard about Paris just a moment ago. And you can see some of it really has strengths in all of the areas within the category. It's probably only shortcoming is with people in terms of it's less diverse than some of the other European cities that we looked at. And then Berlin. So Berlin was also mentioned in terms of, this was actually number 3 in our rankings overall in the Place Equity Report. And what defines Berlin more than anything else is its programming. It's the experiences, as we heard about from our friend from Antwerp this morning, that Berlin was something that he aspired and looked at in terms of, and we see that in our research and our data, that Berlin really outpunches its size in terms of its influence because of the variety and volume of experiences that it offers are quite high, and that really is its competitive advantage. And this is Rome. Again, Rome is probably not where it really lacking is in the promotion. Rome is behind the other cities in terms of the attention it should be commanding relative to its strengths in the other areas. Vienna, similar to Rome in terms of, again, fairly well-rounded brand, but probably not as strong in the promotion side as it could be, considering the quality of its achievements in the other areas. Amsterdam, city very, in our research, really driven in terms of its prosperity and business-oriented, is defining its identity, strong and all well-rounded in most of the areas, but if it stands out for one thing, it's the economic prosperity that happens there relative to other cities in Europe. Prague, another interesting model, and again, you see Prague is actually quite strong in our rankings, but it really lacks in the promotion side in terms of how much the world talks about Prague should be higher relative to its other strengths in terms of its place, product, programming, and people. And I put this one as an interesting example is Zurich in Switzerland, which is in our top 10, but what really defines Zurich are the people in terms of the educational attainment and diversity of the population there and the prosperity that happens there. But when you look at the programming, not as much to do, not as many interesting things as Philip Kotler said. There are not as many interesting things to do in that city based on our mining of social media data and rankings. So the last kind of closing point is really leave you with this, and please come visit us. We have hard copies. We've looked at 104 cities in the EU and happy to talk about your particular destination or city in more detail. But I'll leave you with this question to think about. What defines your destination's competitive identity? Is it place in terms of parks, recreation, natural and built environment? Is it product in terms of institutions? Is it the programming, like Berlin, in terms of the software of experiences that happen with your city? Is it the people? Is it the prosperity? Is it your marketing? It's a combination of all of these things, but it's unlikely that your destination or your city excels in all 6 of them. We can't all be a London and we can't all be a Paris. And our message for smaller cities and centers is to focus in on the key areas that you are strong in, leverage those strengths, work on your weaknesses, but understand who you are first before you develop your promotions and branding campaign. If you'd like to download a copy, you can go to ResonanceReport.com and download an electronic copy, but as I mentioned, we have lots of printed copies that we'd love you to come and take, so I don't have to take them back to Vancouver on the plane. Thanks for your time, and I look forward to taking questions later on. Thank you.